Welcome to Simulation and Prototyping. My name is Carl Dobman. For this short tutorial, I just want to take you from the kind of endpoint where we've been with this module in terms of producing a solid cube that's had 5 cuts taken out of it. And so if you've arrived at this point, you've been able to develop this whole grasshopper definition, which allows us to see the transformation of the cube with each successive cut, each cut that's been taken out of it, and an overlay of the volume on it. So that's pretty exciting. So congratulations. For the class, what I was asking with this assignment was to take a number of these output objects, the final option, and to kind of render them, really simply render them with light and make 2D so that we can get some line work for those. And so let's go through that process really quickly. So I've got at the end of my process here, we've got a finished piece. And in my grasshopper definition, I pulled a brep container all the way over to the end so that as I make changes and as I see what this looks like, I can output, or I can bake that geometry, and I'll pull it to the side, and I'll do one more. Change some of the random components. I will bake this option. And now I have these two. I'll move this one to the side, zoom selected. I can orbit around them. And then I just want to put them together. Get a sense of these two, the massing for these two buildings that may be overlapping. I'll select the two of them. It's going to be a really bad drainage moment right there. We're not going to worry about this for now. I will solid union these two. This then became one object. And off to the side, I have a few others that are already there. So if I pull this over, you can see they're not in the same plane. So I'm just going to select them and look in all 3 views. We can even snap them. And move them. So now they're on the same plane. They're arranged this way. And what I'd like to do is come back to a perspective view. And I'm going to save this view. We've done this before, so we'll set view, go to named views, and I'll call it maybe rendered 2. And close it. So now we've got this. I want to do 2 other things before I set this up. The first is to create a plane that these will sit on. And the Rhino render will give us a ground surface, but if we actually make us a planar surface, I just want to make it large enough that it'll be kind of infinite as it relates to our view. So we can now double check our view. We'll go back to set view, rendered 2. As long as we don't see any of the edges, we'll get that entire surface there. So let's check where so these are sitting on the surface nicely. We can just double check in one of the side views. That looks good. And even what I'd probably prefer is just that if they're not sitting directly on the surface, they're at least poking through the surface on the bottom, because if they're floating above the surface, we'll get an extra shadow that we don't want. So that looks good. The last thing that I want to do is to give it some light so I can control this. So I can, let's find our render tools tab. And let's create a directional light. This gives us really simple options, and a directional light will give us parallel shadows, the same as the sun. So we can set this in. It looks like the first thing you click is the target, the second thing you click is the light. So we can move this into range. And let's look at it in different views. We can rotate it up. And as we do this, we can even come over and come to a rendered view over here. And so we can start to get a sense, or we can even come to our specific saved view and get a sense for where the shadows are. So if we want to change it at all, we can start to see maybe where the shadows would be placed as we orbit this around. And so maybe that looks pretty good for our shadows. We'll get a better sense. We can come to a larger view. Right now, that's just rendered. We can also look at ray traced. This is going to take a second for me because I've got a number of different applications running. And so we can get a sense for where the shadows are very quickly from the real-time render. I might just change some of the settings, or there's one setting that I want to change for my light. And so if I come up here to the view, let's see, I need to select the light. And when I do that, we get the properties. So the light's on, the color's white, the shadow intensity, we want full shadow intensity, but maybe let's turn this down to 50 and see what happens. Maybe even 25, and we can render it, and we can check and see how that looks. Again, this is just the real-time rendering, so it's not really giving us the full sense of this. And so what I might do is just, let's see, we'll go up to render, and let's check render properties. This will open a dialog box. So this opens a dialog box. What we really just want to check here is where we can render full screen, 72 DPI, backdrop is white. All of these things seem fine. And then maybe what we'll do is there's a simple setting. So there's final quality. Let's change it to draft quality. This will go a little bit faster for us. And we'll come back up to render. Maybe I'll just change this back to rendered or even ghosted. And then I'll come to render on the top and come down to render. This will open a new dialog box, and this will render this one image. So we can even start to get a sense for some of this. I'm not seeing very sharp shadows here. And so I want to go back, and that may be because of the intensity. So I can close this window. I can come back and select my light. Maybe I'll turn the intensity back up to 100. We can always make this a little more dim. I might also have the sunlight on, so we can check that. So we'll check the render properties again. Current viewport, that's all fine. We don't necessarily need skylight. I'm going to turn that off. Everything else looks okay. And if you're, because I'm recording, my computer's really, really slow, you can change, if it's starting to look a little bit better, you might go up to good quality. I did see a difference when I rendered with the final version. It took longer, but it was really, really crisp and nice. So we'll set this up. Hopefully this looks good for the shadows. And then we might just make one simple change for the ground material, which could be nice, but we'll see what this looks like and make sure that the shadows are nice and crisp, and then we can go from there. So already we can see really, really crisp shadow. The light has been turned off, which means that maybe we're getting maybe too much in terms of the shadows here. We do want a little bit of light. And so maybe that was the wrong call. So let's go back. We also changed two things at once. And so we changed the light intensity and the lighting. So let's do skylight. We could also change this intensity here too. But why don't I just change one thing at a time so we can see what happens. We'll leave the skylight on. We'll render this. So even with my thing running pretty slow right now because I have so much happening, I can get a sense that it looks pretty foggy. And so what I might try is just one more option. Again, working iteratively with a lot of these things. I'm going to stop this and I'm going to try and change the, we saw the difference between having the environmental lighting and not. And so maybe now I'll just try and split the difference for the lighting where I can change the intensity. And so if it's set to 1, maybe I'll set this to be 0.5 now. And we'll see if that helps kind of soften the very harsh shadows. And while we're here, the other thing that I can do is to just change the material. This isn't necessary, but I can change the material of the ground plane. And what I looked at doing was just is changing it from a kind of plaster material to a plastic material, just to give us a little bit of, I want to leave it as white, but it will give us a little bit of reflection in there. And so let's see how this looks. We'll render this one. So even before this is complete, I can see that I'm getting a nice balance between a kind of clarity of the shadow and the shadows not being totally black either. And so again, a nice balance. So I'll let this finish rendering and then we'll save it and we'll go to the next step. So the rendering is complete. We have a couple of options here, and just the gamma as an option is going to change the black, the kind of amount of black in the scene. So you can see as you change it from 1 to 1.8 and you manipulate these, it'll just start to kind of change that contrast. And then once you have what you like with that, let's save this. We'll just go up to the save image as. I'm going to find my right folder. This has been the massing. And then let me call this massing rendered. And maybe even just W for our working file, and I'll save that. So now what we'll do is we'll transition, well, let's do one more step. We'll close this. And then what I want to do is I can hide my ground plane, or I can just select my objects that I want to make 2D. And then the command is simply make 2D. And we want to use our view because that's the same view that we rendered with. We want to keep those exactly the same. We want our tangent lines, hidden lines, and our scene silhouette, and let's group these. And so we'll say, okay. That worked. Now we should go to our top view and zoom out. And this tends to be somewhere over near the origin. So these are our make 2D. And the way that we have a good sense for that is if we are looking in our perspective view, that make 2D only really looks right when you look at them from the top view. And so just be sure that you're looking at the right thing. Go to your top view, select these, and just like we did for 3D printing, I'm going to export just the selected objects. I only want those lines. And so I'll come up to File, Export Selected, and then let's call this, we don't want to save a stereolithography file. This time, we want to actually save an Illustrator file. So we can do that, and we'll call it, I think it was massing rendered W. So this we'll give it the same name, but it'll be an Illustrator file. And so we know that these two will go together. I'll say save. I'm okay with these as the defaults, and I'll say okay. Now we'll open up Illustrator, and we'll bring these two things together. You can really spend some time in the rendering stage of kind of tweaking the light and tweaking the shadows and starting to play with the materials. And the same goes for your time in Illustrator as we want to start to tweak the line weights and some other things with that. So here's Illustrator, and I'm going to open my Illustrator file first. So the one that I just saved. And so this is our line work. If we want to, let's say, change the size of the sheet, for instance, or other types of things, we can do that. We can do that here. Let's look. We can edit the artboard, or we can change the, if we want to go to landscape view, if we want to go to 11 by 17, we can work with our sheet sizes here. In terms of layers, we can see that we've got 4 layers here. What I want to do is make an additional layer for the image. And so I can put that in, and I just want to grab it and drag it to the bottom. I want the image to sit behind all of the lines. And so the next step is we'll go to Place under File, and we want to place our image. And so this should be right under it. Second most recently created file, massing rendered. That looks good. We'll place this in here. Holding down Shift. I'm going to resize it. And so now we can see it was rendered in my view in more of a kind of portrait format, but my sheet size is more of a landscape format. And so that's fine. I can set these. And what I'll do is I'll lock my image file if that's where I want those to be. And I can select all, Control A, because my image is locked. And now what I'll do is I'll just kind of iteratively work and kind of left to right a little bit. I'm going to choose like this corner in the rendering and this corner in the line work and kind of set those, and then hold down Shift and drag so that I get these to be kind of a similar size. Move it into a kind of position and see if that looks pretty much right. You can scale up, you can scale down, you can reorient it. And then what I would do is now play with the line weights a little bit. So you can figure out what's what. These are the tangent lines, which I actually don't want those. And nor do I want it on this one over here. And so we can leave that one off. Our next one is our dashed lines. The next are the kind of interior lines. And the last is our profile lines. The profile lines I actually want to clean up a little bit and connect some of these. And so I'll come up to the pen tool and make sure I have that layer as current. And just go anchor to anchor. For some reason it didn't close all of those. It can get confused sometimes for some of the profile lines. But this is easy to clean up and just add in a couple of these lines. And in this case, we have an extra line. You can see it extends past, so I'll delete that, and then I'll just add in that other line. So our profile lines look pretty good. They're maybe a little thick, so I can select all, and under stroke, I can even pull this out. And so under stroke, maybe I'll set this to be 1 point. We'll start kind of simply, and let's turn on our next layer. We can lock the profile line. We can select everything on this layer, and then maybe let's go to 0.5. We'll see how this looks. A little bit thinner. Could probably even get a little thinner from there. And especially because in some of these areas that are just white, just having a little bit of a line helps to make the difference. And then our dashed lines, we can lock our edge lines, select our dashed lines. We can set these to be 0.25. I tend to set them to also be black and then deal with a very thin. So maybe we'll start with a 2-point dash and a 1-point gap. And that starts to look pretty good as well in terms of what we see going on in the background. You might realize we're off a little bit, and so we could tweak all of these. If we want to tweak the line weights, we can make sure our image is locked. I'm actually just going to delete that tangent layer. And with all of these, we can select it and maybe make it a little bit bigger or move it around ever so slightly. We can see how that works for us. So play with this a little bit. You could also take the image into Photoshop, play with the contrast, play with the exposure. You can play with the line weights, but have some fun with this. And this is a way now to have a nice set of presentation drawings. What's nice about the dashed lines here, if we turn these on and off, is that the dashed lines just give us a hint about what's going on kind of through the object without having to see these as completely transparent or just wireframe. We get the shadow, we get a sense of the mass. And so play with this a little bit. Let me know if you run into any problems. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what you make.